The worn green work jacket hanging on the back of his pickup's passenger seat said everything about Warren Aldred that he would never say about himself. It was patched at the left elbow, the collar was permanently darkened from years of summer sweat. A small yellow pin near the breast pocket read "Safety First." 15 years no incident, and it was the kind of pin most people wouldn't even notice, but Warren had worn it every day since the plant manager handed it to him across a folding table at a retirement lunch no one had really planned properly. He was 47. His hands were the hands of someone who had spent 2 decades fixing things other people couldn't figure out how to break. The jacket was in the passenger seat, because his daughter Maya's hockey bag was in the back, and his thermos of black coffee was wedged between the center console and the gearshift. And there was a permission slip for a school trip to the Biodome tucked under the sun visor that he still needed to sign before Friday. He'd been meaning to sign it since Tuesday. He pulled into the underground parking garage of the Hargrove Grand Hotel just before 9 in the morning on a Thursday in late February, when Montréal was doing what it always does in February, making you wonder why anyone chose to build a city here at all. The kind of cold that finds the gap between your scarf and your collar. The kind of gray sky that feels personal. Warren wasn't a guest at the Hargrove Grand. He wasn't there for brunch or a conference or a wedding rehearsal. He was there because 6 weeks earlier, the hotel's chief engineer had called a contact at Warren's former employer, who had passed the name along with a single sentence. If you need someone who actually understands legacy HVAC integration with modern building automation systems, call this man. So they had called. And Warren had listened, asked 3 questions, said he'd need to see the mechanical room first, and showed up that Thursday morning in his green jacket and his 2009 Silverado, with the dented rear bumper and Maya's hockey bag in the back. He found a spot to the service elevator on level B2. Not the farthest spot, not close to anything marked reserved. Just a regular spot in a regular row, the kind of spot a person parks in when they're planning to be inside for a few hours, and aren't trying to make a statement about anything. Warren locked the truck, tucked the thermos under his arm, and walked toward the elevator. He didn't see the hotel's director of guest experience, Renee Fontaine, watching him from the far end of the garage. Renee had been director of guest experience at the Hargrove Grand for 11 months. She was 38, efficient, and had built her professional reputation on the idea that a 5-star property communicated its standards through every detail, including which vehicles occupied its lower parking levels. The Hargrove Grand's underground garage served both hotel guests and a small number of pre-approved service vendors. It had recently been upgraded with new lighting and freshly painted lines, and there was talk of adding valley staging to level B2s as part of a broader renovation package being pitched to ownership. Renee had not been part of the conversation about Warren Aldred. What she saw was a pickup truck that had clearly lived a long life, parked in a space near the service elevator, driven by a man in a work jacket who had not come through the guest entrance. She called down to parking security. She did not check the vendor access list. She did not call the front desk. She made a decision based on what the truck looked like, and what she believed a space near the service elevator of the Hargrove Grand should look like. And she moved on with her morning. Warren was in the mechanical room on sub-level 3 when his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, which turned out to be a parking attendant, letting him know his vehicle had been flagged for removal and was being processed for tow. He read it twice. Then he stood very still in the middle of a room, full of pipes and junction boxes, and a building automation panel that hadn't been properly configured since 2019, and he breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth, the way his grief counselor had taught him after Claire died. 3 years ago now, 3 years and 4 months, to be precise, though Warren had stopped counting months, sometime around the 18-month mark, when Maya had asked him why he always got quiet on the 23rd of every month. And he hadn't had a good answer for her. He put the phone in his pocket. Then he picked up his thermos, climbed back up to level B2, and stood in front of the empty space where his truck had been. The hockey bag was in there. Maya had practice at 5:30. He had groceries to pick up before then. Because there was nothing in the fridge, except half a block of old cheddar. And the kind of optimistic condiments that accumulate over years, and never get used. And there were the blueprints he'd printed at the FedEx on Sainte Catherine the night before. The original mechanical drawings for this building, from 1987, that he'd tracked down through the city's building permit archive, because the hotel's own facilities team had told him the records were lost. The records weren't lost. You just had to know where to look. He stood there for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. There's a particular feeling that comes from being dismissed before you've said a word. Not anger exactly. More like a heaviness. The kind that settles somewhere behind the sternum and reminds you of every other time it's happened. Warren had felt it before. He knew how to carry it. He went back inside and found the facilities coordinator, a young man named Andre, who had been assigned to escort him around the property that morning. Warren explained calmly that his truck appeared to have been towed. He asked if someone could look into it. He said he'd like to continue working while they sorted it out. If that was all right, because he still had the automation panel to assess, and he'd prefer not to waste the trip. Andre looked mortified. He made several calls. Warren went back to the mechanical room. The problem Warren had been brought in to assess was not a small one. The Hargrove Grand had undergone a partial renovation in 2021, during which a new building automation system had been installed to manage HVAC, lighting, and energy consumption across the property's 18 floors. The system was meant to reduce energy costs by approximately 30%. Instead, it had created a cascade of integration failures with the original mechanical infrastructure. Failures that the installing contractor had been unable to diagnose, that two subsequent engineering firms had attempted and abandoned, and that had now been quietly bleeding the hotel an estimated $40,000 a month in excess energy costs and emergency maintenance calls for 14 months. The hotel's general manager, a man named Conrad Bellafleur, who had been running the Hargrove Grand for 6 years, and who had the kind of face that had learned to stay composed through a great many difficult situations, had been told by his most recent consultant that the problem might require a full system replacement at a cost somewhere between $900,000 and $1.2 million. Conrad was the one who had made the call to Warren Aldred. He was in a meeting on the 14th floor when Andre reached him. The message was relayed through two people before it got to him clearly. The mechanical consultant they'd brought in that morning, the one with the original building drawings, had had his vehicle towed from the B2 garage. Conrad set down his pen. He asked who had authorized the tow. The answer came back within 90 seconds. René Fontaine, director of guest experience, had flagged the vehicle to parking security at 9:14 that morning. Conrad excused himself from the meeting. Upstairs, in the executive conference room where Renee was walking a junior team through a new guest feedback protocol, her phone buzzed with a message from Conrad's assistant, asking her to come to his office at her earliest convenience. In hotel language, earliest convenience meant immediately. She didn't yet know why. In the mechanical room on sub-level 3, Warren Aldred had found it, not immediately. It had taken him about 40 minutes of methodical work. Checking sensor configurations, cross-referencing the original drawings with the current system layout. Tracing a set of inputs that shouldn't have been mapped the way they were. But when he found it, it was almost elegant in its wrongness. The installing contractor in 2021 had mapped the new automation system to a zoning configuration that assumed the building had been retrofitted with updated ductwork in the east wing. It hadn't been. No one had caught it, because the original drawings were supposedly lost. And without the original drawings, you couldn't see that the system was essentially operating on a false model of the building it was supposed to be managing. It was the kind of mistake that was invisible until you had the right information. With the right information, it took 40 minutes. Warren wrote his findings in his notebook. A spiral-bound Hilroy, the kind you can buy at any pharma for $3, with his name written on the front cover in permanent marker, the way Maya had taught him to label things after she lost her first good pencil case in grade 2. He wrote clearly, in the shorthand he'd developed over 20 years, and when he was done, he had 4 pages of notes and a repair sequence that he estimated would take a licensed team about 3 days to implement. He also had, conservatively, a solution that would save the hotel somewhere in the range of $500,000 over the next 2 years. Compared to the cost of the full replacement, they'd been quoted. He was reviewing his notes when Andre appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. To tell him that Conrad Bellefleur would like to speak with him upstairs, and also that they were working on retrieving his vehicle, and that the hotel would of course cover all towing and storage fees, and that he was very sorry. Warren thanked him and followed him to the elevator. Conrad Bellefleur met Warren in the 14th floor boardroom, where 2 other senior staff members were already seated. Conrad was a man who had been in the hospitality industry long enough to recognize when he was in the presence of someone who knew something essential. And the moment Warren sat down and opened his notebook, Conrad recognized it again. Warren walked them through it the same way he'd walked through problems his whole career, without drama, without performance, without any particular interest in making it seem more complicated than it was. He explained what the contractor had done wrong in 2021. He explained why the subsequent consultants hadn't found it. He explained, in plain language, what needed to happen to fix it, and approximately what it would cost, and how long it would take. The 2 other staff members asked questions. Warren answered all of them. At one point, one of them asked whether Warren was certain, whether he could be sure this was the actual root cause, given that 2 certified engineering firms had reviewed the system and come to different conclusions. Warren said he understood the hesitation. Then he opened to a specific page in his notebook, and laid the original 1987 building drawing beside it on the table, and showed them, side by side, exactly where the 2021 configuration diverged from the actual physical layout of the east wing ductwork. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when the answer to a very expensive problem becomes suddenly visible. Conrad looked at the drawing. He looked at Warren's notes. He said, "How long have you had these drawings?" Warren said he'd printed them the night before. Conrad nodded slowly. He asked where Warren had found them. Warren explained about the city's building permit archive. That if a building was constructed, or significantly modified under a permit, the drawings were typically on file. That you needed to know the permit number, which was usually registered with the property's municipal record, which was public information. Conrad nodded again. "No one told our facilities team that." "No," Warren said. "Sometimes people assume records are gone instead of looking." There was a pause. One of the other staff members glanced at Conrad. It was at this point, this particular, charged point, when the boardroom understood exactly what had just been placed in front of them, and exactly who had placed it there, that Conrad's assistant appeared in the doorway, and said, quietly, that René Fontaine was there. René had spent the walk from the executive conference room to Conrad's office, assembling a reasonable explanation for whatever this meeting was about. She was still assembling it when she stepped into the 14th floor boardroom, and saw a man in a green work jacket, sitting across from Conrad with a notebook and a set of old building drawings, and understood, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives all at once, what she had done. She recognized the notebook actually. Andre had mentioned a man with blueprints. She had not made the connection until this moment. Conrad introduced them. "René, this is Warren Aldred. He's the consultant I brought in to assess our automation issue. He's been here since 9 this morning." A pause. "He drove here." René stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she came in, and she sat down, and to her credit, and this mattered, later, to the way the story was told among the hotel staff, she didn't try to explain or minimize what she'd done. She looked at Warren and said she owed him an apology, that she'd made an assumption she had no basis for making, and that she was sorry. Warren looked at her for a moment. He thought about Maya's hockey bag. He thought about the permission slip still under the sun visor. He thought about the way it felt to stand in front of an empty parking space, and know exactly why it was empty. He said, "I appreciate that." Not warmly, not coldly, just honestly. The way a person speaks when they've accepted something without pretending it didn't happen. Then he turned back to Conrad and said he'd need to leave by 4 to pick up his daughter, and that he was happy to continue the technical discussion until then, if that was useful. It was useful. Very useful. Warren's truck was returned to the hotel's front entrance. Not the service entrance, not the parking garage, the front entrance, at 1:47 in the afternoon. The towing and storage fees had been settled. Someone had run it through the complimentary car wash on Santa Laurent that the hotel used for guest vehicles. which Warren hadn't asked for and wouldn't have thought to ask for. He didn't see it until he came downstairs at 4 o'clock, when Andre walked him out through the lobby. The Silverado sat in front of the Hargrove Grand's glass doors under a February sky that had gone the particular shade of white that sometimes, in late winter, almost looks like light. The green jacket was still on the passenger seat. The thermos was where he'd left it. The hockey bag was in the back. The permission slip for the Biodome trip was still under the sun visor. Andre shook his hand at the door. Conrad came down himself, which Warren hadn't expected. Conrad handed him a folder, a formal letter of intent for a consulting agreement to oversee the remediation work, plus a separate note outlining a longer-term retainer for ongoing facilities assessments. Warren looked at it. He said he'd review it that evening. Conrad said they'd like to move quickly, given the costs involved. Warren said he understood. They shook hands. Then Warren got in his truck, adjusted the mirror, and pulled away from the entrance of the Hargrove Grand. He stopped at the IGA on the way home, because the Old Cheddar was not a meal, and Maya had a game on Saturday that required actual carbohydrates. He signed the Biodome permission slip in the parking lot, leaning it against the steering wheel, with the pen he kept in the cup holder. He texted Maya to say he'd be there by 5, plenty of time. She sent back a single thumbs up, which is what 14-year-olds send when they love you but won't say so. He drove home through the gray February streets of a city that is, despite all logic, a genuinely wonderful place to live. And he thought about the problem in the East Wing ductwork, and he thought about how often the answer to something complicated turns out to be simpler than everyone assumed. It just requires someone willing to go looking in the right place. The following Tuesday, Warrens signed the consulting agreement with the Hargrove Grand. The remediation work began the following week, carried out by a certified mechanical team that Warren supervised across 3 days, as he'd estimated. The automation system was correctly mapped to the building's actual configuration for the first time since the 2021 renovation. The hotel's energy costs dropped. The emergency maintenance calls stopped. The projected savings over the following 24 months landed close to what Warren had written in his notebook, in the sub-level 3 mechanical room. In the shorthand he'd developed over 20 years, in a $3 Hilroy spiral bound, with his name on the cover. Renée Fontaine requested a meeting with Conrad Bellafleur the week after the remediation was complete. She proposed a new intake protocol for the vendor access system, a process to verify and log all pre-approved contractors before any parking or access issues could be escalated. She wrote the protocol herself. Conrad approved it. It went into effect the following month. She also sent Warren a short email. Not corporate language. Just a few sentences, direct and plain, saying again that she'd been wrong, that his work had made a real difference to the hotel, and that she was glad he'd stayed. He read it on his phone while Maya was at practice, sitting in the arena lobby with his thermos of coffee, watching the Zamboni finish its loop. He wrote back 2 sentences. He said he appreciated it. He said the building was in good shape now. The green jacket stayed in the truck. It usually did. Warren had other jackets, but that one had the pin, and there was something about it. Not vanity, not sentiment exactly, just the particular comfort of wearing something that had been exactly what it was supposed to be for a long time. Maya asked him once, sometime that spring, whether he ever thought about getting a newer truck. He said he thought about it sometimes. She said the heater made a noise. He said he knew. She said, "Is it going to break?" He said, "Not if I keep an eye on it." She seemed to accept this. She went back to her phone. They drove home through streets that were finally, after a very long winter, beginning to look like they remembered what spring was. Some things are worth more because they've lasted. Some people walk into a room, and no one looks twice, until the moment when everything depends on what they know. And sometimes the difference between a problem that costs $1 million and a problem that costs 3 days of honest work is simply this: somebody took the time to look for the answer, instead of assuming it was gone. Warren Aldred knew where to look. He always had.